Hello and welcome to Lecture 2, Module 2 of our course on the history of alcohol. And this week we're taking a pretty close look at the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Islamic tradition in the history of alcohol. And looking at the deep roots of alcohol's usages, prohibitions, attitudes towards, attitudes against alcohol in these traditions gives us a very profound history of alcohol. We can see a lot of its roots, some of which these condemnations of drunkenness and what's the line between moderation and excessive drinking are addressed in these early traditions. Now, I'd like to start with a question, though, and that is, why is religion and alcohol so intricately connected with one another from its earliest history, its earliest recorded history anyway? When these ancient texts of the ancient Torah, the Old Testament in the Christian tradition, as it's called, the Quran a little later on in early medieval history, why do they have this obsession with alcohol, you might even say? It figures so prominently, not just in areas of morality when it comes to overindulgence, but it features so much in its celebrations. It's used widely, ceremonially. It's used medically at this time and recommended. It's used for signs of good health. This will be somewhat different in the Islamic tradition, but even there we'll see that there are some exceptions to this overarching prohibition of alcohol within the Islamic tradition. And in fact, early on, as we'll see, Muhammad warned against its use, but did not call for its complete abolition or complete and utter abstinence from it. I'll get to that in a second, though. I should also say that this class and this book that we're using as our guide through the history of alcohol does primarily focus upon the Western tradition, or that coming out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and we don't look so much at Eastern attitudes towards alcohol. We do a little bit later in the semester when we start talking about imperialism around the globe. And of course, we mentioned the early civilizations along the Yellow River and the rice wines that they made very early on. But we do have a focus here on the Mediterranean, from Africa, Asia Minor, or the Middle East, and Europe. For example, Buddhism, the religious tradition of Buddhism, looks very askance at the use of alcohol and generally prohibits it altogether if you want to reach higher levels of awareness and enlightenment. So keep that in mind, that there's a lot of material here in the overall global history that we aren't covering. So let's get back, though, to our focus. One of the earliest prohibitions within the Christian tradition of alcohol altogether doesn't really get off the ground until the 19th century. And even though in this chapter we're largely focused on matters ancient, there is this reinterpretation of the biblical sources and the Bible particularly by scholars in the 19th century that emphasize the inherent evils of all alcohol. It's not surprising that scholars in the 1800s began looking more skeptically at alcohol because that was a time of the rise of temperance, as we'll see later in the semester, and even calls for outright prohibition of all alcohol. But that interpretation of the scriptures is a radical departure from earlier definitions of of alcohol's place within Christianity. There had not been calls for its complete prohibition or abstinence from alcohol completely in the Christian tradition, really until the 19th century. And they gave us this idea that there are actually two different types of alcohol described in the Bible, or two types of wine. Because one of the things that, of course, they had to explain was, if wine and alcohol in general is so evil, why did Jesus turn the water into wine, famously at that birthday party back in ancient Palestine? Well, the answer that they gave, their interpretation, emphasized that there were two different types of alcohol in the Bible, two different types of wine. In fact, most wine that is talked about in a positive light is not actually alcohol, does not contain alcohol in large quantities. So the wine that Jesus made was more like grape juice, right? That's up to interpretation, right? It's not surprising that these scholars saw it that way, because alcohol was increasingly seen in the 1800s as being inherently kind of evil. You still see this in Christian traditions today, and you can still go to many churches today, and if you take communion, you will not be served wine. In the more conservative churches, especially in the South, in Baptist traditions and kind of the more radical Protestant traditions, wine will not be served, grape juice will be served. Now, beyond that argument that there were two different types of wine being described in the Bible, wine is still integral to the Christian tradition up until the 1800s. It's served in monasteries. It's the most commonly referred to plant in the Old Testament, the grapevine, that is. You read in chapter 3 as well about the various stories in the Bible that include seemingly moral tales about alcohol and its usage and misusage by Noah. And, after the great flood, Noah plants a vineyard. It's one of the first acts that he does. Only by the time he's able to get wine out of his vineyards, presumably several years later, to become drunk and commit these sort of sexual transgressions. You see the same thing with the story of Lot and his daughters. The sin here is drunkenness and sexual impropriety, even incest, right? So the overall picture of alcohol in the Old Testament, in the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, in the early church, even of Christianity after its adoption by the Roman Empire, is rather conventional. There is an embracing of wine as good for one's health, for living a full and happy life. God punishes people by taking away their vineyards and they're spoiling their wine. And what is mostly condemned is drunkenness and excessive use of alcohol. A term I want to point out to you that's also mentioned in chapter 3 of your textbook is transubstantiation. This is the idea that the properties of wine change when you take it in the communion or in the Eucharist, but its appearance does not. So, in other words, there was this belief, particularly prevalent by medieval times, by the 13 and 1500s, that when you take communion, the bread and the wine transforms into the blood and flesh of Christ when taken in that context. And in the medieval time, up until the time of the Reformation, religious figures spend a lot of time thinking about transubstantiation and the role of wine and the bread in the body. Again, central to ideas of Christianity are alcohol either symbolically or literally. As I said, there is this tendency, as pointed out in chapter 3, for the Christian church to promote wine drinking over beer drinking. This is probably not so much a religious or theologically driven decision that the church makes, but rather it's, in my interpretation at least, more a matter of the Christian church's connection with viticulture, with the raising of wine. So the ancient church expands, of course, with its adoption by Emperor Constantine and the Roman Empire in 323. That's still a huge empire at that time, stretching around much of the Mediterranean up into Europe, and much of the economy of the Roman Empire was centered around wine production. Wine production and the drinking and consumption of wine was very much akin to life in the ancient Roman world. Having said all that, there was a connection in the early church, even before Christianity's adoption by the Roman Empire, to depict Jesus as almost a kind of a wine god. A lot of the iconography, the symbolic depictions of Jesus in the earliest times, in the earliest Christian church, the 2nd and 3rd centuries, depict him as being present at that famous birthday party where he changes the water into wine. So wine is in many ways celebrated in the ancient church. That doesn't mean that drunkenness is celebrated, however. And by the medieval times, from about the 10th century to the early modern period, there is a growing importance of the production of beer and wine in church institutions, specifically within the monasteries of the church, in as I said, in that medieval period. I might add here, it's important, if you haven't had many history courses at this point, that you have a certain sense of these periods that I'm referring to. The ancient period, the Roman Empire, the era of the Roman Empire, and then the onset of the medieval age by the 9th and 10th centuries, going up to the time of the Reformation in the 1500s or 16th century. That's kind of basic historical knowledge that I'm presuming all of you have. In a chapter like this, we kind of zip back and forth a little bit between the different ages, because we're talking more about big trends and concepts and ideas within these three great religious traditions, the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, and the Islamic tradition, which are all part of the same tradition of what Christians, Jews, and Muslims all call the people of the book. They see their traditions as being connected. Abraham, even in the Islamic tradition, was a prophet. Of course, the most important prophet in the Islamic tradition, who resets everything, is Muhammad. So this might be a good time to turn to Muhammad and leave the Christian tradition behind in the monasteries, with their beer and winemaking. They even made mead. That's this drink made from fermented honey. In places like northern England, they kept those fermentation secrets, how to make beer, how to make wine, very secret at this time, because it made their monasteries more valuable, more centers of the community. And just one more point, though, before I turn to Islam, and that is that beer lends itself at this time not so much to long-distance trade as wine. Beer doesn't travel well. We'll learn in the medieval era they add, some new ingredients to beer that make it more readily transported. But until they can figure out how to preserve beer better, it doesn't work well to put it in big kegs and barrels and ship it long distances. That is where wine is so important. And that's why wine is spread all across during the Greek and then the Roman period as well, across much of the Mediterranean region. But what about Islam? Well, it's first important to say that in the first few generations of Islam, during and after the time of Muhammad, in those formative decade, in its formative century, in the 700s up into the 800s, there isn't a blanket prohibition of alcohol within Islam, though its consumption is looked at increasingly with skepticism. What Muhammad does say about wine in the Quran, in his teachings, and the Quran is a collection of the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, is that it exacerbates all social problems that exist in society. It makes everything worse. If there's homelessness, introduce alcohol into the situation, there'll be more homelessness. There'll be more thieving. There'll be more lying. There'll be more sexual impropriety. And because humans are inherently wicked, according to Islamic teaching, as well as Christian teaching as well, because people are inherently sinful, one way of reducing our sinfulness is by abstaining from alcohol, from staying away from it. This is increasingly interpreted by later generations as meaning a complete prohibition on alcohol. The Sharia law within Islam prohibits the consumption of alcohol. Now, in most early Islamic empires, such as the Ottoman Empire, the usage of alcohol was not altogether prohibited in their realms, in their empires, but instead it was discouraged. Drunkenness was punished, although the penalties for drunkenness were fairly mild unless you were a religious figure. And if you were a non-Muslim in the Ottoman Empire, for example, you were allowed to drink alcohol. Vineyards were not destroyed. The production of alcohol, by and large, was not blanketly prohibited, as it would be in the 20th century under the United States experiments with prohibition, many centuries later. And we see there are exceptions within the Islamic traditions to the uses of alcohol. In fact, there's an argument that's made by some within Islam at this time, in the early medieval time, that it's not so much wine. Let me rephrase that. It's that wine and things made from grapes that are most prohibited and spoken negatively about in the Quran, and not other forms of alcohol. Particularly, they were thinking about beer, since distillation doesn't really exist much yet at this point. That argument doesn't gain a lot of traction within Islam, but it exists. So maybe beer is not bad because beer is not really talked about specifically in the Quran. You also have the Sufi tradition within Islam, a more mystical interpretation of the Islamic tradition that emphasizes poetry, literary expressions of different sorts, of meditation, of becoming connected with all of the universe in this kind of mystical way. And there's evidence that they had more liberal attitudes towards a lot of things in the material world, such as wine drinking, such as consumption of alcohol. The Sufi tradition is a bit of an exception within the other traditions going on within Islam, and certainly by modern times that Sufi tradition will be more and more eclipsed by more stringent interpretations of the Quran that ban the use of alcohol altogether. I might also draw your attention to, in chapter 13, to the descriptions of the use of wine in southern Spain, for example, in this important city in Spain for Muslims at this time, Granada. Granada was a Muslim stronghold in Europe. It will be a center of Islamic learning. It's heavily influenced by Africa and the African Moors who settle there in large numbers. You can see depictions of the greatness of the Islamic civilization there in southern Spain, in Granada, at the Alhambra Palace, this most magnificent of palaces. We have examples of wine being enjoyed in Granada, during the medieval period, during its sort of golden era. So there are some exceptions, but increasingly there will be prohibitions against the consumption of alcohol and all forms of alcohol within the Islamic traditions, particularly the two main traditions of Sunni and Shia. Okay, so that is an overview of some of the themes that we see brought up in chapter 3 in your textbook. You might want to listen to this lecture again if you didn't take notes the first time. I look forward to talking with you more about these subjects on the discussion board.